Welcome, everyone, to Westcliff University's Distinguished Innovator Speaker Series. And our last speaker of the 2021 series, Jay Elliot, who is senior member of the original Mac development team. He ran all corporate operations and became a mentor and a friend to Steve Jobs during the startup years, the quote unquote startup years between 1980 and 1986. I know you've seen all the bios on YouTube and you've read Isaacson's bio on Steve Jobs, but Jay knows the real story of Steve Jobs, a personal perspective, because he lived it. I'm Dr. Barry Sandrew, Director of Entrepreneurship at Westcliff and your moderator this evening. I'm really happy you were all able to join us, and we'll get to Jay in just a moment. But first, I want to briefly introduce Westcliff University to those in the webinar audience who might not be familiar with the institution. Here is our campus in Irvine, California. Westcliff is an accredited private institution of higher learning with approximately 4,000, actually more than 4,000 students enrolled both online and on campus. There are 4 colleges at Westcliff. The College of Business offers the bachelor's, master's, doctoral degrees in business administration, as well as certificate programs. The College of Education offers a BA, a master's in teaching English as a second language, the Real Intensive English program, and certificate programs. The College of Law offers the Juris Doctoral degree and certificate programs. And the College of Technology and Engineering offers BS and MS degrees in IT, an MS degree in computer science, and an MS degree in engineering management. To learn more about Westcliff, including our awesome undergraduate athletic program, I invite you to visit our website at westcliff.edu, as well as Westcliff University on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. I want to introduce Jay, as Jay is a serial entrepreneur, former Apple exec VP who mentored Apple founder Steve Jobs as the company grew from 150 million in annual revenue to 3 billion back in the turbulent days when John Scully came on board as Apple CEO. Jay has had more than 40 years of operations experience with such corporate giants as IBM and Intel. Like Steve Jobs, who was known for his tenacity and passion for startup entrepreneurship, Jay continues to innovate today with his latest startup, Tigo Health. We'll learn what it was like working with the iconic Jobs, particularly during those chaotic years. And I'm really interested in learning from Jay what made that guy tick.
Today we celebrate the first glorious anniversary of the Information Purification Directives. We shall prevail.
On January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh. And you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984.
You remember that one, Jay, don't you?
Absolutely. First time that the stores had people lined up around on the sidewalk. Unbelievable.
It was Ridley Scott.
Yes, Ridley Scott was the director. Mostly was filmed at the airport in Paris, the Paris airport. And it was set up. And at that time, the board of directors and John Scully disapproved showing it. And it turned out to be the most incredible ad ever done in the history of advertising. It only showed once on TV at one time. It was on the Super Bowl. It happened to show right after Marcus Allen ran 76 yards for a touchdown. It was the fastest he ever done. Can you hear me?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, because my screen went off, unfortunately. He ran 76 yards for a touchdown. Right after that touchdown, which was the longest touchdown in history of the Super Bowl, that ad appeared. So it was amazing what it did.
What was really amazing is that nobody in Apple wanted it to be even shown.
Right.
Yeah.
Only Steve and Steve Wozniak will also, it was going to cost $1 million. And they said they'd put up their own money to run it. And after they said that, and they had one day to make a decision. The decision was made and they ran it. And it was an amazing ad.
Oh, yeah. I think John Scully said that they got $45 million in free advertising because all the news stations were showing it.
Absolutely. And now the bad news is the following year they did another ad, which would turn out to be a terrible ad. It was done by Ridley Scott's brother, and it was called
Tony.
Lemmings.
Tony Scott. Yeah.
Tony Scott, right? And it was called Lemmings. And it was really a takeoff on IBM and them mindlessly walking off a cliff in their blue suits and white shirts. And it was totally negative to teachers, and teachers hated it. And it was just, it only ran one time, and nobody ever saw it again. That was the end of it. So you never know.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you mentioned IBM, because let's go back. Let's go way back. And I want to find out how you got started with IBM and Intel, and how you actually met Steve Jobs.
Very interesting. My life is sort of unusual. I grew up and did a bunch of things, but I'd gone to college on an athletic scholarship, but I just got caught up in playing basketball and baseball, and so then I dropped out and fooled around and did a bunch of things, and decided I better go back to college to get a degree. So I went back to college, got a degree in mathematics, then got accepted to law school at the University of California. Went to start law school, but I took an elective class in computers. In those days, you're carrying punch cards around in a box. And after one test, the professor came to me and said, "Wow, you really understand the system. You're looking for a job?" I said, "Yeah, I'm working at a gas station." So he said, "I can get you an intern job at IBM." So I went to work at IBM as an intern and started doing very well. And one thing led to the other, and I eventually got hired at IBM. So that was my IBM thing. But IBM, I felt all of a sudden I was thinking about technology. I grew very fast in IBM. I only programmed for about 6 months, and then I grew up into management, and ultimately took over their development lab called Santa Teresa Laboratories. And I had 2,000 programmers working for me, and actually 20% of them were PhDs. So it was a pretty high level programming lab. But I felt that at that time, IBM owned the computer rooms, and I felt that it had to go beyond that. And so I'd already in my mind was thinking about how to put a computer in somebody's hand, but just started thinking about it. And that's when I really decided that IBM was in the right place. I went to the chairman of the board of IBM and said, "Hey, computers are kind of a computer room. I had an idea for a thing called you now know as an ATM today, which is how you get money out of a bank." And they rejected all my ideas. And so one night I decided to leave IBM and go off in the world. I was at a restaurant and sitting in the lounge area and waiting for a friend of mine for dinner. And this kid sat next to me. He's about 26 years old and in tattered Levi's and a tattered t-shirt. And I was reading an article, and he happened to look at the same article I was and said, "Do you know anything about computers?" I said, "Yeah, I'm an executive at IBM." And I said that in a way to sort of reject him, like I didn't really want to talk to him. And then suddenly we started talking, and I said, "Wow, this kid has vision similar to mine." And I sort of caught my attention that he seemed to be knowing what he's talking about. The name Steve Jobs, the name Apple, I had no knowledge of either one of them. And so at the end of the conversation, he said, "I really want you to come to work for me." And I said, "No, I really don't think you can afford me." He said, "Yes, I can afford you." And then he said, "What would it take to get my attention?" I said, "Buy me a new car." I love Porsche 911 SC. So 2 weeks later, a Porsche arrived in my driveway in my house. And that's how I got going with Steve Jobs. Now, by the way, the interesting part of that story is I did not know, but Steve loved German engineering. He loved Porsches. He loved Mercedes-Benz. So if I'd said a Ford or a Chevy or a Cadillac, I probably would never got to work with Steve Jobs.
Yeah, and he used to give away Porsche watches to everybody. If anybody who admired his watch, right?
Yeah, he had a box of them. And these are like $3,000 watches, titanium watches. He had a box of them in the corner of his office. And if you came to him with some great idea or something that he really appreciated, he would give you a new watch. And mine actually broke after about 20 years. And it couldn't be repaired because of the band broke, which was titanium. There's no way to repair it. I should have kept it. Unfortunately, I threw it away. But anyway, that was very interesting. He loved German engineering.
Oh yeah, I think that you weren't really. I don't think IBM was your place anyway, because I know that you grew a beard while you're there, which is very unusual there.
Yeah, it is very unusual. In fact, I used to go to Armonk, New York, and that was the only beard probably in 50 miles away from Armonk.
Right. And so I think I think you told me somebody told you that we have wild ducks here, but they all fly in formation.
Exactly. And I mean, that was a very clear message that I got from IBM. Although I had a very good relationship with the chairman of the board, so I think that's what he wrote. He said something I disagree with. I wrote him a long letter, and every time he came to the West Coast, we would get together. That was so I had a very interesting relationship with IBM. But yeah, right. I mean, being a farmer, coming from a ranch industry, and being sort of an entrepreneur, the beard was probably what I should have been anyway.
Yeah, probably. So Apple was around for 44 years, I think, when you came there, right? 4 years? Longer than that?
Yeah, it was
How-
see, but I 80, so they were there 3 years.
3 years. So it was
Right.
a startup, essentially.
Right.
What was it like there?
It was very disorganized, and I have to tell you a very funny story. So I took over, and I came there. I took over the operations of Apple. One of them was IT, obviously, and I went to visit the IT director because I knew she was also from IBM. I heard, so I went down to visit her. I walk in this computer room; it's all IBM equipment. So I went to Steve and said, "Do you realize you're saying that your enemy is IBM? Realize what you have in your IT room?" And so I went and replaced it all. But the one thing people don't realize about Apple, everything we did was planned. There was no luck at Apple. Steve, the one thing about Steve is everything you did was planned. So there was not like, it just was happenstance. He built a company that took off and made billions of dollars like some of these do today, but it was not luck. It was all planned. And that's one thing that nobody really appreciates about Steve, that everything we did from walking into giving people computers to employee relations was a planned situation. It wasn't by luck. He had the right people. Talent was very important to him, to have people that could build this company in a way that would be very successful. So that was very interesting. Talent, very interesting.
Yeah, speaking of talent, yeah, he made a lot of mistakes. Well, in terms of talent, tell me about Black Wednesday.
Well, Black Wednesday was a guy that they had brought in, and some of the first major investors in Apple were semiconductor people, and they brought in a semiconductor guy that took on the company, and the Apple III, which actually was a great product, had a cable that rubbed against the keyboard and gave you a shock. So the Apple III was recalled out of the market. And the guy was the CEO at that time, happened to be looking out his window and saw about 100 people milling out in the street about 2 p.m, sort of commiserating, and decided the Apple III was a total disaster. It was called, and it had to be put out of business. And so he decided we need to lay off 100 people to show people that's not the thing we can do ever again in the future. So he just laid them off, and there was no discussion. I mean, you just can't lay 100 people off without having a reason, and it's illegal actually. And so we had to resolve that, and then he got fired. So that was the beginning of Steve taking over the company actually.
But there was one guy in particular during that time that was called into Steve. I can't remember his name, but basically he thought he was going to be fired, and I think Steve said, are you talented or something like that? And he kept him, and he actually he said, well, he wanted him to join the Mac team, and he said, well, I have to finish a few things first.
Right.
And what happened after that?
Well, actually, he became the architect for Lisa, and actually he joined Steve actually in Next. So
okay, but Steve actually went down to his computer and put it in his Mercedes and drove him over to the right.
Right. Yeah, absolutely right.
Yeah, but it seems like Steve was always very demanding about what he wanted, even if it seemed impossible to actually accomplish. And I know that there was one case in terms of hard drives, for instance.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And he wanted to build his own hard drive.
Right, called Twiggy. Right.
Twiggy.
Right.
Which is not an easy thing to do.
No, in fact, I came from the hard drive business at IBM, so I know the technology of hard drive, and it was really a stupid decision. In fact, we bought a company called the Keyboard Company down in Garden Grove, California. Interesting thing about that company, they were the one first building the mouse. And also they were the largest builder of IBM keyboards. So we went down and visited them, discovered that, so we bought them. And at a very, very low cost. Actually, we now own the company that produced all the keyboards for IBM, which was good because we cut them off. But anyway, the Twiggy was he loved this guy. He was a German engineer. He loved him, thought it'd be great. He wanted to build his own hard drive. He wanted to build everything in the computer. And so we said no. Eventually decided, we brought a guy from a hard drive company in Japan, one of the engineers, and actually hid him in the back of the Mac building. So Steve didn't know we had him there. So he was feeding us information to convince Steve that we can buy a better hard drive in Japan than we can build one. And eventually that's what we did. And actually, the funny thing about it is that we decided to cut off the hard drive business, and we pulled in the guy running it. And I said, Steve, we got to get him over, tell him we're going to pull it out, but we will take care of all the employees. There was 300 employees. We'll give them jobs if they want, wherever they want, or if they want to leave, we'll give them a good severance package. Steve brought the guy in, and we started talking. And Steve, I said, he just kept like small talking the guy about certain things about technology. And I said, Steve, you need to tell him why he's here. He said, I wish I could get above the meeting and tell him what. And I said, we can, very easy. You and I walk outside. We'll talk about it, and you come back and make a decision. We'll walk outside. Steve, you got to tell him we're stopping the hard drive business. Walk him back and sit in the meeting. He says to the guy, Hans, Jay said to tell you that we're stopping the hard drive business.
Is it true that at one point, one of these engineers was visiting Apple, and the executive actually hid him in a closet?
That's what I'm talking about. That was the hard drive guy.
That was the hard drive. Yeah, hid him in a closet because they were doing it. You were doing it behind his back.
Right. We wanted to have all the technology and because he was destined. He wanted to build this hard drive, and so we had to have as much ammunition. Me and the engineering manager to convince him. And I came from the hard drive business. I knew how difficult it was to build a hard drive, and didn't make sense because companies like Alps and these other companies in Japan were building very good hard drives, and so. That's the guy. We brought him from Alps actually to come over and put him in the back of the building so Steve would never see him. And we just used him to give us information to finally get Steve to agree that we would need a different hard drive.
You know, one of the most remarkable things about Apple, the story about Apple, is Palo Alto PARC, Xerox PARC.
Right. Yes.
You found the mouse that roared.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Xerox was. People realize Xerox PARC has produced so many products, so much technology in the world. It's unbelievable. And so when I got hired by Steve, we did a deal. I got hired, and I hadn't started yet. And he called me on a Saturday morning. He said, "Come to the office. I want to show you something." I got there at 10 a.m. We jump in his car. We zip up to Xerox PARC, it's about 40 miles away. And Steve typically driving 100 miles an hour, and there's radio blasting. At that time, he either the Beatles or the Police, and so going to Xerox PARC, they showed us this product they called Apollo, and on it was a mouse and a screen with icons on it. And we go look at the function. It was connected to the end of a major printer. And so we left there. As we were driving back, Steve said, "That's the product we're going to build." And I said, "Obviously, I mean, I don't know how we can do that. They already got it." So no, we're going to build it. We're going to build a better one. So we get back. He calls an engineer at home, comes in and said, "I want you to go to the pharmacy, buy one of those roll-on deodorant things and a soap tray. And I want our mouse to look like that. I want to have one ball in it, one button on it, and be about the size of a plastic soap tray." So the guy went and bought one. That became the prototype for the mouse that we built at Apple. But again, Xerox, at that time, Xerox owned 10% of Apple. They invested $10 million. They eventually sold that investment about 2 years later. They made like 40 million. But today, Apple would be obviously, that investment in Apple would be worth about $50 billion. But Xerox produced all kinds of products. They never did. Amazing.
Yeah. Steve Jobs is kind of an enigma. I mean, because he was a hippie for one thing. He traveled to India for almost a year, and he got really interested in Zen Buddhism, which really influenced his design work. Correct?
Yes, it had a huge influence. Plus the way he lived. I mean, he lived as mostly as a vegetarian. He lived in without sort of possessions around him. I mean, a lot of, he didn't went to his house. There was nothing in the house but a couple of chairs and a lamp. Um, and he just was a very simplistic person when it came to possessions. He just like wanted his car and he wanted his word the place to live, but he just didn't really have an idea of having all these other possessions. And that sort of was, I think that had great influence on simplicity. It had a great influence on that I, as a user, can use something simply so that anybody can use it. And think about it today. The cell phone is 80%, 5 trillion people or 5 billion people in the world are using a device in their hand called a smartphone. And that all came from Steve. I mean, there's nothing more simplistic than being able to have a device in your hand that you can communicate actually any place in the world. I think that simplicity was what made Steve so great at what he did.
Yeah, here at Westcliff, we're focused on lifelong learning, that sort of thing, and lifelong learning involves things much more than book learning.
Mhm.
And I think Zen Buddhism definitely influenced him, as well as calligraphy. Correct?
Yes, calligraphy was huge. The understanding everything he did really came from calligraphy. To look at the way things look, the way they function. Simply, there's a design. That's why I love German design, because it was sort of very similar to that. And all in the original Mac, it was done in sort of this design. We happened to be in a restaurant in San Francisco. We ran into a lady there. There was actually a waitress, and she was actually the person that came up with the original logo design for Macintosh, and she became part of Apple. And so it's like he was always like design and talent were the two things that really influenced him. And plus, what Steve had, which is really interesting, he had a vision, not only what we're going to do today, but what we're going to do out in the future. But he had a way that he understood you have to implement today to get to the future. I think that's a mistake a lot of visionaries make, is that they don't understand you got to implement today to get to the future. And as I see today, a lot of stuff done is they don't understand that. And plus, it was totally for the user. It starts at the user, and that's where everything around that is for the user. I think I told you the idea or the story about this fish tank that when he felt that the iPod and the original iPhone were too bulky. So he, with a group of engineers, took it, dropped it into an aquarium, bubbles came out of it, and he said, it can be made smaller because you can see bubbles are coming out of it. I mean, he was very simplistic about he was a user. And I think that's something that America's CEOs today need to really understand. You got to be a user of your product and really understand what the user experiences to really make your product better.
Yeah, I got to ask you this one question, because whenever I give a presentation about new technology, I always talk about two different types of approaches towards new technology. One is a field of dreams, which would basically, build it and they will come, like the Magic Leap and the metaverse and that sort of thing. And then Steve said that you have to start with the consumer and work backward to the technology. But I got the impression from your book that he probably didn't have that much respect for the consumer. What he was really probably talking about is himself, the ultimate consumer. Am I right?
Yes, it wasn't, when he was talking about the consumer, it was him. And it was him, I'm building this product for me. If you don't want it, don't buy it. If you don't like it, the hell with you. I'm building it for myself. So he was the consumer. Now, it wasn't, he loved, however, to be out in the world and read people that loved his product. I mean, that was, yes, he loved that, but he was building the product for himself, and he was the consumer. And that's a really important, interesting way to look at it. And that's everything he built about the product had to do with him. And again, if you don't like it, don't buy it.
Yeah. And he sort of personalized, he anthropomorphized about all of his products. Like, for instance, I think there was a shipping thing where he actually went into the shipping department and said, okay, I'm a Mac.
Right.
What happens to me?
Right. Yes. Yeah. In fact, he went through that, said, I'm a Mac, and what happens to me? I mean, I've just come off the assembly line. I'm standing here, and I'm a Mac. So what happens to me? And they boxed him up, showed him how they put the box in them, how they shrink wrap it, put it on the pallet sent off to be shipped away. I mean, it's like, and he did that for every feature of the product, from going from one end to the other of the product, understanding the whole lifeline of the product. but he wanted excellence, not only for the product, but everything that was done in the product and with the product. And he wanted to make sure that the shipping process was done as well as the design of the product itself. And now, the other thing was interesting, we tried to ship the first Mac without a user's guide. And that's really important. That the idea was, we said, no, we can't, it's just, there's too many new things here. You're using a mouse and how to connect it. There's too many things here. You got to have a user's guide. Now, today, typically products come from Apple without a user's guide. That was the first thing. We got to build a product you do not use and need a user's guide. That was his #1 challenge. We couldn't do it with the first Mac.
He wanted everything to be incredibly intuitive. And somebody said, well, you know, we want the user's guide to be as simple as a 12-year-old could do it. And so he actually went out and got 12-year-olds to do it.
Yes, we went out and found a guy that was in a school. We did a contest in a school, and he won the contest, and he came in and really helped design the first way to use a Macintosh. In fact, it's funny, I never thought about people retiring from Apple. It's like, I actually created a badge called the 5-year pin. It was an Apple logo and had 5 diamonds on it. And I say, maybe it makes it to 5 years, lots of luck in this company. But now I find people retiring. It's like they have badges that have 30 diamonds on them. It's interesting. I never thought of working for a company that long. I'm sort of like a 2 or 3 year guy. I like to work for 2 or 3 years and move on. But you know, there's people actually retiring from Apple today, which is interesting to me.
Yeah. Well, after 5 years, I think you got a month off with pay, but it wasn't really a month off. You basically had to come back with new ideas.
Exactly. But the intention was to go off, think about what you've been doing, what you're going to do, and come back with a way to regenerate yourself and repurpose what you're doing to make it better. That was the whole purpose of that month off, with getting the badge. No, I got fired, by the way, just a month before I never got a badge. I have the original prototype, by the way, so that I have that, which is probably more valuable.
He recognized that he didn't, at that time, he didn't want to be the CEO. He wanted to be concentrated on the product.
Right.
And he interviewed John Scully, and John, who was CEO of Pepsi at the time.
Right.
And he was famous for the Pepsi Challenge, which really was another marketing campaign that was really, really significant. And he didn't know if he wanted to come to Apple. And what did Steve say?
Steve said, you need to quit selling sugar water and do something for good for the world, theoretically. I mean, that's really what he said.
Yeah.
I didn't approve of John Scully coming to Apple. I told Steve he was making a mistake. Steve was highly influenced by MBA classes at Stanford. And he gave a speech in an MBA contest, and he happened to mention a speech. He was looking for somebody to join Apple. And they were all, Scully had just been there giving a talk about marketing and so forth. And they said, wow, this guy's great. He did the Pepsi thing and so forth. But it didn't work out. He comes to Apple. He didn't know anything about computers. He never used a computer, I don't believe. And he knew nothing about computers, and it was a big mistake. And when Steve left to leave Apple, my recommendation to the board of directors was create a new company for Steve called Macintosh. Let Scully run the old Apple, because it's going to run into the ground, because Macintosh is going to take over the Apple II business. And they chose not to do that and leave Steve go. But it was clearly the wrong person.
Oh, he definitely, you can tell he was. I mean, he was basically selling, I mean, their upgrades were the same old thing, every year,
exactly.
Anything that was in commodities. And he was also, he wanted an open architecture as opposed to Steve wanted a closed architecture.
Absolutely, right. That was a huge conflict.
Yeah.
And that's an interesting debate, by the way. I mean, I meet a lot of people that think that should have been open. But the difference is today, if you look at an iPhone, you have complete control of the architecture and complete control of the service. If you have an Android, you don't know who the manufacturer could be, from Samsung or somebody else, but they get updates from Android. They get updates from the people that you may not get that update. I mean, when you have an iPhone, you're directly connected to the people building the product, and you get all the updates. So there's a huge, I think it's the right way to go. It just depends what you want to do with your product, obviously open or closed. But I think that's the big advantage of having an iPhone.
And John basically pushed him aside because he was so he was intrusive in the business, and Mac wasn't doing well. And you know, there there I ran a public company once, and I know what Scully was probably dealing with because the Mac was not selling well.
Right.
Lisa, I mean, the Apple II, Apple IIe were doing great, and especially in
Right.
education.
Right.
And Scully had to answer to, the board and the investors. So he basically moved him aside, right?
Yes. And that was the purpose, was to move him aside. And that was a big mistake. I think the Mac wasn't doing well. The other problem is what Steve, and actually it was Freddie Smith. I set up an executive commit. I brought in executives and have dinner with them with Steve to try to get Steve to learn from CEOs, like Lee Iacocca. And it's funny, I'd bring these guys in. I mean, Lee Iacocca was an incredible executive. In fact, when I called Lee and invited him, he said, "How many Dodge fans does Apple own?" I said, "None." He said, "Buy 4 of them and I'll come and meet with Steve." So I bought 4 Dodge vans. We had dinner with 5 minutes in the dinner. Steve is controlling the dinner. I mean,
Yep.
These guys are learning from him. And so
They
Freddie
get along
Smith,
well.
right. And Freddie Smith from FedEx was one of them he brought in. Fred said, "Hey, you should be selling Mac directly to the consumers. I'll fly them to them for you." And he was right. And that's eventually what happened in the computer market.
Yeah, and Steve he imagined having an airstrip right next to Fremont plant.
Exactly. Right? In fact, there was space out in the back. He was already planning to have an airstrip out there so the FedEx planes could come in and pick up the Macs. And because the problem is, at that time, the distribution system was computer stores who made their money off peripherals and education. Neither was part of the Mac sale. And so they were making any money. And so they brought people in to see the Mac, but they sold them something else. And that was that's why Mac failed. Plus, it wasn't ready. Didn't have a hard drive in it. Didn't have a color screen on it. And it wasn't ready. But Steve was destined. He wanted to get it into the marketplace, but it wasn't ready.
And yet he built an assembly plant in Fremont.
Yes.
Robotics.
Yes. That plant, by the way, produced a Mac every 24 seconds. That plant would have been very successful if Mac was successful.
Yeah.
Because it would have been cost effective. In fact, it cost us $180 to build a Mac. That would have been the cost to that plant. And they were selling for $2,400. So that's an interesting dynamics. But unfortunately, the volume was low. The volume didn't happen, and it just didn't work out. And
did it really cost actually $20,000 to make each Mac?
Yeah. Oh, if you took all the cost of the plant and added it to the Mac, yeah.
Oh, okay.
But over time, it would have been the cost actually is about 100 to have the product assembled to the plant and out the back door was about $180. But if you put all the overhead of building a plant, that would have been taken care of later. But that's not what happened. So
when Scully came in, they were like bosom buddies. They were great. They were finishing each other's sentences supposedly.
Right.
But then it went sour, right?
Yes. In fact, they would sit at the end of the table together. So if you had a conference table, at the end of the table, they would sit next to each other. Scully brought the same car Steve had. Steve had the same Mercedes Steve had. And it was like bosom buddies. And all of a sudden, as things started going bad and things that weren't, the Macintosh started failing, Steve went to Scully and said, "Hey, what's going on in sales? You got to get sales up and blah, blah, blah." So we took a trip and we visited all the sales places in New York City. Steve and I did like secret shoppers. In fact, he put on a baseball cap and dark glasses, and we went through all of the computer stores in New York City to find out what really was going on with Macintosh. In fact, at that trip, we also met with Bill Gates because Bill had agreed to do some development on the Mac, which he never did. Very embarrassing meeting because Steve did not like Bill Gates. And at that meeting, he was very rude to him and very, very unfortunately, but he was right to a degree. But anyway, we discovered that in that going to that sales trip, but it wasn't. And then we came back ready to say, "Hey, we have a problem." And so we had a sale. Scully decided to hire 2,000 salespeople to help sell Mac directly like IBM. It was like the IBM plan. And so we had 2,000 salespeople we hired secretly, had a sales meeting in Hawaii, and we did the meeting, came back to Cupertino, in Hawaii, it was clear that the division between Steve and Scully was not going to be able to be solved. So I pulled them together in a meeting and said, guys, you got to fix this, because you can't have the CEO, chairman of the board, Mac, and all founder of the company openly having this debate. You guys got to get together. In that meeting, Steve got so upset, he started sobbing, crying. And I knew at that point that Scully had him, because he could go to the board and say, this guy's unstable. That's exactly what happened. And then shortly thereafter is when all hell broke loose. And then they had a board of directors meeting and they threw Steve out at that time.
Basically, he went to the board and said, it's either him or me, right?
Right, exactly, right. And I went to the board around Scully and said, you guys are making a big mistake. Steve is a founder of the company, not only that, but he's a founder of the technology, which is going to be the future. And you guys you're not going to have that if he leaves. And Scully doesn't know what the hell he's doing. So I got fired ultimately for the same reason. So shortly after Steve got fired, I got fired. Fortunately for me, I ended up in a 5-year lawsuit, which I won against. And actually, my lawsuit, one of the reasons Scully had to leave Apple. So I did get a little bit of revenge out of it.
Yeah, but then Steve went into Next, and he basically found out he heard that there was a market for that particular computer in higher education, right?
Yes, and there was a guy at Stanford, in fact, a Nobel Prize winner, that convinced him that they really needed a supercomputer for education. That's what he built. That was his whole market. But unfortunately, that's a different market, and there really wasn't a market for it. And so Next really was failing. Pixar was the secret to success wasn't Next, but they built the software for Next, which eventually became back to Apple. So that's interesting what happened with Next.
And you after you left Apple, you went into the entertainment business, and you actually introduced George Lucas to him, because
Yes.
George had a computer system, basically a graphics animation system.
Yeah, he had out of ILM, he had building a computer system to do graphics and to do editing. And so it was, Lucas wasn't doing well. And so one of my consultants at Apple was also a consultant to George Lucas. And also through the TV industry, I met him also. So I set up a meeting. And actually at that meeting was Doug and Susie Tompkins. You remember? They were the entrepreneurs that formed Gap and Esprit. In fact, Doug bought actually the tip of South America. I think he bought over 1 million acres. He owned the tip of South America when he left, when he sort of cashed out. But they were at the meeting also. So it was an interesting meeting with George and them, and they made a deal. He bought that group for $10 million. And then he gets it. But in the group, which he didn't realize, was a guy named John Lasseter, who had an idea for a thing called Toy Story. And he also had an idea they already had been doing some 2 or 3 minute video stuff. And that's what eventually Steve never wrote checks. Steve never had money. I mean, I used to say, if you're going to go out to dinner for Steve, people say, oh, I'm going to dinner with Steve tonight. I'd say, well, great, but make sure you're going to pay. So make sure you have money. And so he had to write some big checks, and particularly Lasseter wanted to do Toy Story. He had to write a check for $20 million. I'm sure his hand was shaking when he wrote it, because Steve never liked to give out his money. And but that turned out to be, that's what really funded him, because then he'd sold it to Disney. It was the largest shareholder of Disney. And that's where his wealth came from.
And Toy Story was the first fully computerized animated feature.
Yes, right.
And Katzenberg kind of snookered him a bit, I understand, because he kept the toy rights to all of the characters.
Right. Yeah, there were parts of that whole structure that Steve didn't, either he didn't understand or wouldn't pay attention to, but it's more than just a movie.
Yeah, so it kind of hedged the bet against, if it didn't do well, they're going to make a lot of money on toys, right?
Exactly right.
But it turned out to be one of the biggest blockbusters of the time.
Yes, and particularly for that kind of automation. I mean, then obviously what it's done, the big blockbuster obviously for Disney. Disney paid a huge amount of money for Pixar. I think they paid equivalent to about $60 million, I think, for what Steve spent $10 million to buy.
And ultimately, Steve sold it for how much?
I think I don't know exactly, but I know he owned about 35% of Disney stock, and so I don't know what that would have been worth, but it was in the billions. So, and that's really the money that his family ended up with after his death. Mostly was
Yeah.
Disney, the Disney stock money. He when Steve came back to Apple, he was given a bunch of stock options. In the old days of Silicon Valley, when I was there, you'd hire somebody and say, "Hey, I'm going to give you this much stock." Theoretically, you can't get stock out of a company until the board of directors approves it, but you would always offer it to somebody. So that happened with Steve. They offered him 21 million shares of stock or something, and the board hadn't approved it yet, and somehow they got legally scrutinized as he couldn't do that, and so he gave all the stock back to Apple. So when he died, he virtually had zero stock in Apple.
Well, yeah, he still won. I think he only had one share left, right?
Right, exactly right. Right.
Yeah. And so the iWatch, the Apple Watch, would he have, what would he have thought of this?
I don't think he would have thought much of it. I think that his idea was the world, things that are going to change the world and things that are going to be new to the world. And I think the whole internet thing, the whole how do we get information to people, I think would have been the next sort of plateau he looked at. Now that he has it in your hands, how do I get stuff to you? I mean, what kind of stuff do I get to you? And I think that would have been the next thing about Apple TV and so forth. Things in the future, I believe, would have been not a device like that, unless he saw that device to be the connectivity that person needed to have to do all these things he wanted you to do with it. But I don't think so. I don't know yet. I mean, it's still, to me, the jury's out about watches and goggles and everything. And I just, I think that's too complicated. But I see the watch taking off now. I mean, it's not now a phone. I see a lot of people have it. And so I don't know, maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, and I'm wondering if he would have thought, what he would have thought about augmented reality glasses that Apple is supposedly going to be coming out with. I mean, it's simple,
Right.
you know. I'm not sure.
Steve was a huge movie buff. He was he loved movies. He particularly loved foreign films. And so my wife's brother had a video store in Menlo Park. And so Steve was their number one client. So unfortunately he died, and I took over the store for a while to get it ready for sort of his relatives. And in there I had the whole list of all the movies that Steve, most of them are foreign movies, and he loved movies. I mean, he was a big movie buff. So I think that's where he would have gone. I think he had this desire to bring content to people, and whatever that form would have taken, I think is where, after Macintosh or after what Apple was doing, is where he would have gone. So I'm not sure the watch would do that. I used to call Steve the king of screens. I mean, he brought you the design of the screen on the iPhone was not by accident. It was on purpose to sort of fit your eyes, and it was the perfect thing to bring you content. And that was what I viewed him to be in the future.
You opened up the very first Apple store, right?
Yeah, I was at the one back in the East Coast. Yes. Well, no, I built the first prototype of the Apple Store in 1984. We actually became the employee store for Apple Computer, but it was really the prototype that Steve and I talked about what a store could be. And we built the first prototype in Cupertino, but it was for employees. But we saw how it worked. I mean, they loved it. Now, interesting about Apple, which again for a lesson, when an employee got hired by Apple, they were given the computer, and they were told, you have 30 days to learn how to use it. They came in 30 days later, took a test. If they failed the test, they got terminated. So that was a part of the deal getting hired by Apple. But think about this. They had to know the product in and out. And they didn't know what the test was pretty simple, but they had to know the product. So if you got hired by Apple, no matter what job you were in, including CEO of the company, you had to come in. I remember I took the test. I mean, it's like you had to come in and take that test and make sure. We also had a thing called iBuddy, which is we would assign a person to you who was an experienced internal person in Apple, would be your mentor. So somebody that was a program that I and Steve put in place, that you want somebody in the company to mentor, no matter who it is. It could be a vice president, it could be a shipping manager, whatever. Somebody we thought would give you good advice to how to become integrated into the Apple culture. And so that it was about the product, and that's really what the important part of that getting into the system was all about.
You know, at one point you talked to Steve about getting into the healthcare business or something of that nature, right?
Yes, I did. Yes. I at the end of my book, I wrote him a letter saying that I believe that the iPhone was an incredible product, and I really believe the next generation of iPhones really should be for healthcare. That people needed to be connected to healthcare. And then when I met him about a month before he died, and I think that's where he was beyond it at that point. Unfortunately, he was like very little weight, and he was sort of beyond it. But I just said, this is an example that I think the iPhone should be the next tool for healthcare. And unfortunately, we never were able to do that. But I think that's where I am today. I still believe that.
Yeah.
And that's what I.
Well,
what I do
you
today.
you actually started a company called Tigo Health, correct?
Yes, right. And that's what we do. So in my product, you can bring your health record, your diagnosis, your doctor, and all your information to you on your phone and have it with you wherever you go. So if you have an emergency someplace, or you need to be connected to your doctor or your hospital or your healthcare organizations, you have it in your hand. And I believe actually the pandemic has helped me, because we're also focused on people in Medicaid who are low income and low have a lot of problems, to help them master sort of the healthcare system. It's a tough system. And I think that you need those kind of devices, and that's what I do today. And that's something I believe that this product is great for. And that's something I think Steve would have been very interested in doing if he'd lived.
Yeah, especially since if I'm in Italy, you had an app basically that would get help no matter where you were in the world.
Right. In fact, yeah, we have an app called Responder. You press the button and it connects into a call center. In this case, in the United States, it connects into 911. Today, there's a company that's digitized 911, so people don't realize this, but when you press a button on my phone, it sends a digital message to the 911 center. And they know exactly where I am GPS-wise. They know exactly who I am, and they know exactly any medical condition they have, which they can then forward to the first responders. So there's a company called Rapid SOS we teamed up with that does that, and so that's what happens today. But you can also press the button. When I was in Italy, I tried it. I could press the button and send to a call center here in the United States. They knew exactly GPS-wise where I was, and they could find the appropriate Italian emergency unit, which I wouldn't know, to help me. So yes, it's a worldwide product. And I believe, I believe this platform is perfect for health. We just got to take more advantage of it.
He was a maverick for sure, and the whole pirates versus the Navy thing, it was really defined him, I think. When he came back, there was another ad. I want to play that real quick. This pretty much defines, this is something he actually wrote.
Right.
Here's to the crazy ones, the misfits,
narrating,
the rebels, the troublemakers, the round pegs in the square holes. While some may see them as the crazy ones, we see genius. Because the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do.
Yeah, and right after, just before he died, I think there was he gave a talk at Stanford, and basically this is what he wrote, and it's basically the same thing. Don't let the noise of others' opinions drown out your own internal voice. Most important, have the courage to follow your heart and intuition. They somehow already know what you truly want to become. Everything else is secondary. Stay hungry, stay foolish. Kind of defined him, didn't it?
It did. The big thing about it is you got to have heroes, and I believe you got to have somebody at heroes, and I believe that was sort of Steve's heroes were Henry Ford, or George Land, the Polaroid camera inventor. And he and I went and met Land, and he was sort of like, it was really sort of a depressing call, because Polaroid had sort of disintegrated, but yet think about that technology. He brought photographs to your hand. That was really the beginning of an iPhone theoretically, and so you got to have heroes. And so I have a hero in my life. Her name was Grace Hopper. I don't know if you know who Grace Hopper is. Yeah. Grace Hopper was the lady who invented COBOL in the early 50s. And she was an admiral in the Navy, so she never got a dime for it. And she retired from the Navy at 85. I met Grace Hopper when I was at IBM, and she became my mentor. And I used to, every time I went back east, I would visit her. I actually introduced her to Steve Jobs, but she was a maverick. Here she was in the Navy. It's like, and yet she was an amazing lady, and she used to give me great advice. I mean, having a heroes is really important. And Steve had heroes, and that's what some of the people you just showed were some of the heroes. But he also had heroes he'd like to integrate with. I was in Italy recently, and Leonardo da Vinci was another one of the heroes. You think about him and Steve Jobs. I mean, there's a lot of similarity to what these people were doing and changing, and it's very, very interesting. So one of my last mentions is have heroes.
Yeah.
That's what Steve was.
You saw him just before he died, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
And was he reflective? Was he, I mean,
Yeah, he
what
was. He was.
Yeah.
We had a meeting in New York with Bill Gates, he and I, and this was about 1985, before he got fired. And he was very rude. He did not like Bill Gates. He was very angry because Bill Gates Microsoft had agreed to do some software for Mac, and they did nothing. And so Steve was very upset with him. And and that was a very distasteful meeting. I mean, left that meeting, it was really upsetting. He was just really rude at him, said some really bad things to him. And after the meeting, I said, Steve, that's not the way to treat people. I mean, it's like, I understand you being very angry, but geez, I mean, that. And so one of the questions he asked me when I met was, am I a good guy? You know, based on everything you know about me. I said, well, I think a lot of people think you're not a good guy and a lot of things you've done. But on the other hand, if you look at the accomplishments, what you've done to society, particularly education, what you did for education was unheard of. I mean, we gave a lot of technology education. Every school had Macintoshes or had computer labs with Apple. I was funny at my son's high school. I went in there and they had an Apple lab and they had a Hewlett Packard lab. And Hewlett Packard lab, nobody in it, and the Apple lab was filled with people. And I said, what you've done for education, people don't really realize. I mean, what you've done to change education based on that fifth grade teacher that gave you some advice is unbelievable. Nobody really understands that. What you've done for society and putting these things in their hands, unfortunately, you're not a severe business guy, and people don't see that. They don't really realize that in your mind, you're trying to change the world, not make money. And unfortunately, I said, yeah, you're a good guy, but people don't really see it and understand it, and they never will, unfortunately. But yes, you're a good guy, but he had hard times to it.
Yeah, you know, I just wanted to show this. These are you're basically a trilogy. The Steve Jobs Way is out of print, but I got it on audiobooks.
Yeah. I really wrote. I was asked after I left Apple. I was asked to write a book, and I started writing and discovered that there was a major publisher really wanted the dirt, and I said, no, I'm not going to write the dirt. I had some ideas, and I have a really good background in leadership, particularly from IBM. I learned a lot. I had some insights. I felt that people really need to really understand what Steve was about. So I wrote The Steve Jobs Way as my first book. Then Wiley came to me, and actually, my second book, Wiley did a poor job as a publisher, but it's actually a better book, I think, than my first one. And my last, The Ana Nuevo book, is really about me growing up on a ranch, milking cows, and then ending up with Steve Jobs. I mean, it's quite a story going from a family that's farmers and no college graduates in the round, and to go through college and ended up working for Steve Jobs. So it's a great analysis of me being born to today, to theoretically to where we are today. So
you hardly milk cows. I mean, you at 15, you were in charge of 1,000 acres farm.
Yeah, my family decided to give me the opportunity to run the ranch. I did. I was 15, but yeah, I did milk cows too. But I learned from that I did not want to be a farmer. So that moment on, I was out of there. So in fact, when I was 18, I was off to college, and basically I was headed into a new life. And so farming was not who I was. But I appreciate the entrepreneurship of being a farmer. Got to know what you want to grow. You got to make sure it's going to make money. Got to keep the farm going. It's a very entrepreneurial life, and I really like it. I think now I'm probably going to go back to a farm one of these days. So because there is entrepreneurship in there that is really unique, and my sons now really appreciate that also.
Yeah, especially your older son, I believe, right? He's a real entrepreneur as well.
No, he's my youngest one, actually.
Youngest one, yeah.
Right. And yeah, he's running one of the parts of my company today. And he traveled with me when he was 14 around the world with my book tours, and decided that after going to a little bit in college, he really wanted to be an entrepreneur. So he joined me.
I keep telling you, I saw one YouTube video. You were presenting in Italy, and you turned it over to your son, who spoke fluent Italian, and he was incredibly charismatic. Very cool.
He's a very good guy.
Yeah. So, you know, this has been a fascinating interview, and I really appreciate your time. You've had an incredible career, and you've got an incredible career still going on. I mean, yeah.
There's not many 80-year-olds who just formed a new company, by the way. So I think that I take pride in that. I think that age has never been one of my issues. It's been, as I said, I'm a 50-year-old. We're stuck in this 80-year-old body, but I think that's about life. It's just, you can't stop. I mean, I just can't stop. I got to keep thinking of new ideas. I just thought of one last week that I'm going to pursue that's very interesting. So it's like, I just have these things in me that I just got to keep things going.
Oh yeah, I don't blame you. Yeah, you know, what's the synonym of retirement? Death.
Right, exactly right. Your death sentence.
Jay, really appreciate you being here.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Jay. And
you're welcome.
Again,
thank you. I appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure. And
Okay,
thank
good.
you.
Thank you very much.